Dr. Doughty, and I'm here to talk about the Renaissance. The Renaissance was renewed interest in the classical world. Although classical art and learning was originally lost in Europe after the classical period, which ranged from 500 BC to 500 CE, it was brought back by way of Muslim scholars and learning that was preserved in the Byzantine Empire. Classical art was very fascinating. Characteristics of it were that the artists creating it valued balance and harmony. Figures were lifelike but often idealized, more perfect than in real life. Figures were nude or draped in togas. Bodies looked active and motion was believable. Faces were calm and without emotion. Scenes showed either heroic figures or real people doing real tasks from daily life. In paintings, there was little background or sense of perspective, showing things smaller in the background and larger in the foreground. Here's an example of classical art. Fascinating. Renaissance art was a mixture of classical and medieval art. The medieval period lasted from about 500 to 1300 CE. Medieval artists created stained glass windows, sculptures, manuscripts, and paintings. Most art was religious, showing Jesus, saints, people from the Bible, and so on. Important figures in paintings were shown as larger than the people around them. Figures looked stiff with little sense of movement. Figures were fully dressed in stiff-looking clothing. Faces were serious and showed little feeling. Painted figures were two-dimensional or flat. Paint colors were bright. Backgrounds were mostly one color, often gold. Here's an example of medieval art. Fascinating. Ponder this mathematical equation. Medieval art plus classical art equals Renaissance art. Renaissance art shows features of both. Art showed religious and non-religious scenes. Art reflected a great interest in nature. Figures were lifelike and three-dimensional, reflecting an increasing knowledge of anatomy. Bodies looked active and were shown moving. Figures were either nude or clothed. Scenes showed real people doing everyday tasks. Faces expressed what people were thinking. Colors were shown responding to light. Paintings were often symmetrical, balanced with the right and left sides having similar identical elements. Full backgrounds showed perspective. Here's an example of medieval art. Fascinating.
Hello, my name is Andreas Bodkis, and I will be talking about the growth of trade and commerce. One reason for the flowering of culture during the Renaissance was the growth of trade and commerce. An Italian traveler, Marco Polo, went along the Silk Road to China and brought back silk and spices along with food and art. Some Italian cities like Venice and Genoa were major trade cities because they were located on the trade routes. This increase of trade led to a new kind of economy. Bartering became and they used money currency.
Banking used to be the devil's business, but then everyone started doing it because it was so profitable.
It was a very joyous time, as you can see. Because of this, the merchants became very rich and provided the cities with beautiful statues and sculptures. Thank you. Today I will be talking about the growth of humanism. The interest in learning during the Renaissance was spurred by humanism. This way of thinking sought to balance religious faith with an emphasis on individual dignity and an interest in nature and human society. Scholars from all over Europe traveled to Italy to learn about new ideas inspired by classical culture. They studied such subjects as art, architecture, government, and language. They read classical history and poetry. They began asking probing questions. What did classical artists find most beautiful about the human body? How did Romans construct their buildings? All in all, for the church, life after death was more important than life on earth.
church rifle sack. Be who you wanna be. I like to study the Greeks.
As you can see, in contrast, humanists believe that people should use their minds to question everything. Thank you.
The city of Florence, Italy, is called the cradle of the Renaissance, and for a good reason. This historical city influenced some of the history's most well-known figures.
Florence.
Dante Alighieri, a Renaissance poet, Donatello, a sculptor, Michelangelo, an artist, and perhaps the most famous thinker of all time, Leonardo da Vinci. Florence's great location, economy, and education system was home to about 100,000 people. Their culture was so rich with art, literature, power, and wealth that let's take a look at some of Florence's architecture.
Hello, my name is Andrew, and I'll be talking about advances in painting and sculpture. During the Renaissance, the art of painting developed and changed dramatically. Paintings had a sense of depth, perspective, proportion, and lifelike backgrounds and feelings. Some examples include the Mona Lisa as seen here.
Done! Mwah! It is my masterpiece.
Note the interesting smile. Another advance included the invention of oil-based paints. This kind of paint was thicker and was easier to work with than egg-based paints. With the advances in sculpture, sculptors during the Renaissance were inspired by humanism, realism, and older Roman ideas. Let's take a look at two famous Renaissance sculptors. Donatello was one of the greatest sculptors of his time. He is known best for his sculpture David from the story of David and Goliath. One critic said it was so natural to believe that it was not molded on the living form. Oh wait.
Alright, we'll stop.
Hello. Today I'll be talking about advances in sculpture. Sculptures during the Renaissance were inspired by humanism, realism, and older Renaissance ideas. Let's take a look at two famous Renaissance sculptures. Donatello was one of the greatest sculptors of his time. He is best known for his sculpture David from the story of David and Goliath. One critic called it so natural, it looked as if it could almost come to life. Great Michelangelo is another famous sculptor of the Renaissance. He also made a sculpture of David, but his was much bigger, about 17 feet tall. This beautiful marble masterpiece is what gave Michelangelo his fame. A critic said about the sculptor, "What a happy age we live in, and how fortunate are craftsmen who have been given the light and vision by Michelangelo." Thank you.